That was an excerpt from Beyond Vietnam, a speech made by Martin Luther King, perhaps expressing some of his more radical thoughts, his more revolutionary thoughts. And I think it's important as we come together to remember that Martin Luther King, who was oriented not only towards the struggle for civil rights, but the economic rights of workers as well, and the more general struggles for equality and brotherhood in society. In November 1967, seeking a middle ground between riots on the one hand and timid supplications for justice on the other, Martin Luther King Jr. announced the Poor People's Campaign, initially planned as the dissension of 2,000 poor people from across America in Washington, D.C., to meet with governmental officials to demand jobs, unemployment insurance, a fair minimum wage, and education for poor adults and children. Suggested to Martin Luther King by Marion Wright, director of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, the campaign was seen as the next step forward in the struggle for true equality and justice. King described the campaign as a highly significant event, telling delegates at a planning meeting that it was the beginning of a new cooperation, understanding, and a determination by poor people of all colors and backgrounds to assert and win their right to a decent life and respect for their culture and dignity. Some members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which King led, criticized the campaign as too ambitious and too amorphous in its demands, to which King responded, "It's as pure as a man needing an income to support his family." On April 4th, 1968, however, King was assassinated. Leadership for the campaign fell to Ralph Abernathy, and on May 12th, 1968, Coretta Scott King led the first wave of demonstrations in Washington, D.C. The next day, Resurrection City was established, a temporary settlement of tents and shacks built on the mall in Washington, D.C., our own Occupy Wall Street. Soon afterwards, Robert Kennedy was assassinated as well. Out of respect for the campaign, his funeral procession passed through the encampment. While the campaign succeeded in small ways, qualifying 200 counties for surplus food distribution and guaranteeing some representation for poor people within federal agencies, Resurrection City came to an end on June 24th, 1968, when its permit to use park land expired. It was symbolic, perhaps, of the closing of one chapter of American history and the beginning of a new era. Though the struggle for civil rights and economic justice went on, the social movement, which had risen to meet those challenges in the 1960s, became divided, splintered, and in the process lost the sense of unification, the sense of a unified vision which had kept them together. The would-be revolutionaries, those who had said, "I have a dream," who had worked tirelessly for the betterment of all and sacrificed themselves towards that end, lost hope. And though the committed few continued to fight, the flame of American democracy went out, exhausted and paralyzed before the tragedies it had seen and experienced. But let us return to April 4th, the night Martin Luther King was assassinated. The sermon King was writing that Thursday evening was titled, "Why America May Go to Hell." King did not think America ought to go to hell, but rather that it might go, owing to its economic injustice, its cultural decay, and its political paralysis. King's dream was turning dark, and he was depressed, sleeping little, and suffering from migraines. As the sun set, he was getting hungry. He shaved, splashed on cologne, and stepped out onto the balcony of room 306 of the Lorraine Motel. A rifle shot fired, slamming King back against the wall, his arms stretched out as if he were being crucified. As he lay dying, a martyr to one of America's greatest moral crusades, there could have been no words for what his loss represented for the movement as a whole. I would ask, what is the legacy of this great man, and just where does his virtue lie? What can be said is that his passionate faith and discipline, that life of conviction and love which he led, does not deserve to be marred with monuments and images of his greatness. We must not confuse symbolism with substance. The greatness of King lies in his patient commitment to the daily struggle for universal human rights, for justice, for equality, and for brotherhood. His greatness lies in what his life may teach us about how to live a moral life. And I must confess to you, a moral life is not a life of comfort. It is not a life of peace. It is not easy. It requires complete commitment. It requires an absolute obedience to one's conscience and the discipline to struggle onward through difficult times and challenging circumstances. A moral life gains its power from an infinite anguish and love, a desire for reconciliation which cannot be brought to an end through simple pleasures and simple activities. A moral life calls us to our true greatness as human beings. It calls us not for self-realization, but for self-sacrifice. We are to be so overwhelmed by that longing which does not abide, by that love which conquers all things, that every petty concern, every finite thing which we might seize and attempt to find ourselves in, fades away before the sublime truth which we have known. But as King said, even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war, as we just said. Over the last 40 years, America has had the most growth in wage inequality in the industrialized world. CEOs of large American companies earn around 275 times more than the average worker. Recent studies suggest that almost 50% of Americans are in poverty or low income. There are 3.5 million homeless people in America and 18 million vacant homes. We have to think about all this. We have to think about just how far we've gone. With the recent passing of the National Defense Authorization Act, American citizens can now be detained indefinitely without due process or trial. The President has the power to decide whether a person will receive a trial in the federal courts or in a military tribunal. Further, we have seen online censorship in recent legislation, warrantless searches of American citizens, illegal surveillance, and extraordinary renditions. No political or military analyst would dare to assert that the United States is any longer the land of the free in its law. Though we have not felt the force of these laws on a mass scale, any basis or process for guaranteeing our civil liberties in this country are gone. The issues of social justice which we face presently are deeply interconnected, even more so than they were in King's time. Yet, as he connected the struggle for civil rights to economic rights, we must do the same. We cannot talk about poverty without addressing the breakdown within our educational and healthcare systems. We cannot talk about education and healthcare without addressing the federal budget, the distribution of wealth in this country, the foreign wars which funnel money into the hands of defense contractors, and the moneyed interests which distort and pervert our political system to serve their own ends. As a participant in the Occupy Wall Street beginning since its inception, I must confess to you, my conscience cries out at all these problems, the suffering and oppression which continues around the world. I watched the Arab peoples rise to defend their rights, to defend their dignity in this last year, and though I knew that our nation had deep-rooted problems which demanded our actions as citizens, I was cynical and dismissive of the idea that a true uprising could happen in the United States. Even as I, along with other individuals, worked to organize the October 6th demonstration for Ashland, I had my doubts that the apathy and isolation which has plagued modern American politics could be overcome. But we have seen a great spirit rising in our time, and that spirit is still with us here today. King would have been here with us, doing the messy work of democracy, real democracy, and reaching out to the American people who stand at the edge of this movement perhaps, and wonder where their place, their role in all of this lies. King said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see an edifice which produces beggars, which needs restructuring." I implore you to consider what this edifice is and how we might begin to restructure it. For King's work is not complete, and we must continue his legacy in the struggle for social justice today. It is our responsibility and our duty to do so. But brothers and sisters, how are we to do this without organization? Without the spirit of participatory democracy, where everyone has a voice at the table and we can come together to face common issues. No issue with which the Occupy movement has been concerned can be addressed in any other terms. The challenges we face are so large and inherent to our current political and economic system that we must commit to the long haul. We cannot expect easy solutions, and we cannot expect any revitalization of our system until we do it ourselves. We must take responsibility for the future of our nation and take up the hard daily struggle of organizing for a more just and equal world. We are entering a world where we will have to do with less. We cannot continue to live in a consumption-based society. The 21st century economy will not be based on cheap oil and mass consumption. We do not know yet what it will look like, but we must begin to organize our communities around this nation to be prepared for it. We must be ready to rely upon one another, to trust one another, because we do not know what the future will look like. When we consider the legacy of King, we must assert the nature of his faith, and his sense of brotherhood was absolute. The commitment seen in his works, the work of his life, stands as a testament to that faith. He understood that the most essential moral problem which we face in the modern world is not evil, the greed of the few, but the apathy of the many. King said, "I submit to you that if a man hasn't discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live." 10,000 fools proclaim themselves into obscurity, while one wise man forgets himself into immortality. Such is the question. Are we capable of accepting the charge of King's legacy as it truly stands? To forget ourselves in a love for those around us, for a better world that we know can be made. I implore you not to consider whether the Occupy movement will succeed or fail. I implore you that what stands before us is an imperative. To act or not to act, to take responsibility or not to take responsibility. For in the final judgment, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Nothing is more dangerous to democracy and justice than the separation of man from his brothers. We are all united in a common fate and must begin to live accordingly. With a mind to the fact that King's words resonate with us from one historic moment of upheaval and change to another, I leave you with a final fragment of King's thoughts. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at the flood, it ebbs. We must cry out and desperately for time to pause in her passage. But time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, "Too late." There is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. We still have a choice today: non-violent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. Now let us begin. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God, and our brothers wait eagerly for our response. Shall we say the odds are too great? Shall we tell them the struggle is too hard? Will our message be that the forces of American life militate against their arrival as full men, and we send our deepest regrets?
No.
Or will there be another message of longing, of hope, of solidarity with their yearnings, of commitment?
Yes!
To their cause, whatever the cost. The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history. If we, the American people, value Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, we should give him a revolution, not a monument.